The war was supposed to be decided by brilliance. At least, that was what German doctrine insisted. Superior tactics, superior leadership, superior technology. The Wehrmacht marched into Poland and France under the belief that quality would crush quantity. Fewer soldiers, fewer tanks, fewer aircraft, but better ones. The spearhead of 1,000 years of supposed superiority. Yet as German soldiers pushed outward, crossing borders like a tidal wave, a strange rumor began whispering through the ranks. A rumor of a gun. Not a sleek new rifle or a secret Allied tank. No, something much simpler. Something brutally straightforward. A weapon the Americans mounted on trucks, jeeps, frigates, bombers, tanks, guard towers, even the backs of motorcycles. A weapon they nicknamed Ma Deuce. At first, German troops laughed. How could something so ordinary reshape the battlefield? It wasn't rare. It wasn't refined. It wasn't an engineering marvel. It was just big. A .50 caliber machine gun, feeding thick brass cartridges the size of a man's thumb, each one capable of punching through steel, concrete edges, or the skin of an aircraft hull. It spat these rounds with mechanical indifference, thousands per minute, sweeping battlefields like a scythe through tall stalks of wheat. German soldiers learned very quickly that there was nothing funny about it, especially the ones who had to fly through its fire. On missions over Italy and France, Luftwaffe pilots approached American bomber formations expecting chaos. What they found instead were airborne fortresses wrapped in rings of fire. Browning M2s bristled from every window, every blister turret, every tail, like giant porcupines armed with death instead of quills. The first pilot who attempted a frontal attack against a B-17 came away with his canopy star-cracked by a half-inch bullet that tore through armor as easily as if it were punching through bread crust. He limped home, his aircraft a shredded witness to this new kind of war. Soon, pilots began describing the experience as charging into a hailstorm of sledgehammers. One bullet could rip off a stabilizer. One burst could turn a cockpit into a coffin. One mistake and the sky itself rained metal. They feared it. Every time German fighters approached a bomber formation, they knew those M2s waited, cool and unemotional, their barrels steady as the gunners inside whispered prayers of survival. Even on the ground, the weapon changed everything. Across North Africa, German troops advancing on American positions often found their light vehicles shredded by invisible hands. Smoke and flame erupted before they ever heard the gun that destroyed them. Trucks they once relied on turned into burning skeletons in seconds. The Browning was not tactical finesse. It was industrial inevitability. Every time a German commander designed a clever maneuver, every time a squad prepared a brilliant ambush, the Americans answered with a storm of .50 caliber bullets that erased the brilliance before it mattered. A tank commander in Normandy once peeked through his optics and saw a P-47 diving toward him, 8 M2 barrels glimmering under the wings like the fangs of a steel dragon. He barely had time to swear before the sky erupted. The rounds chewed through his turret like a butcher tearing meat from bone. When he woke hours later, his ears were still ringing with the echo of those guns. There was a quiet cruelty to the weapon. It did not care if the target was heroic or legendary. It made no distinction between a tank ace and a terrified conscript. To the Browning M2, everything was simply a target to be removed. And it could remove almost anything. Concrete bunker? Gone. Half-track? Shredded. Sniper behind a wall? Wall becomes dust. Aircraft at 1,000 yards? Shot out of the sun. The sheer presence of the Browning meant German soldiers could never feel safe. Not in trenches. Not inside vehicles. Not behind cover. Not even flying above the clouds. And the most haunting part? There were millions of them. Factories across the United States produced the Browning M2 with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Each one rolled off the line ready to change a soldier's fate. Ammunition piled up in endless crates. Ships delivered them by the thousands every week. There was no shortage, no rationing. No moment when an M2 sat silent for lack of rounds. German officers stared at captured stockpiles in disbelief, struggling to understand how an enemy could build so much so fast. They had been told America was soft, weak, overconfident. Instead, they saw a nation that treated war like math. And the numbers never lied. The Browning M2 was everywhere. Ubiquitous, relentless, eternal. Even when the German army fought brilliantly, the M2 made brilliance irrelevant. No wonder soldiers cursed it under their breath. No wonder pilots flinched when they saw tracer fire. No wonder tank crews prayed the sky would stay quiet. For German troops, survival became a matter of hoping the Americans hadn't brought their .50 calories. They almost always had. The Germans developed a unique vocabulary for the American .50 caliber. They called it the dreadful nail, the sky saw, and in some infantry circles, simply the fire. None of the nicknames were flattering. All of them conveyed terror. As the war turned its momentum against Germany, the Browning M2 seemed to follow them wherever they retreated. In Normandy, it was the unseen guardian over every hedgerow. Panzers that once rolled confidently across Europe now found themselves pierced and smoking from bullets that were never supposed to harm tanks at all. A desperate German sergeant once remarked to a comrade that the American rounds seemed to ignore reason and punish everything they touched. He wasn't exaggerating. Infantrymen learned that diving behind a stone wall for protection was a gamble at best. The .50 caliber punched through masonry as if the battlefield itself had turned against them. The bullet didn't just arrive. It reshaped the environment, chewing through the very things soldiers trusted to keep them alive. The psychological toll became undeniable. German soldiers who once feared nothing now feared open ground. They feared roads. They feared the clear sky. They feared aircraft not because of bombs, but because .50 caliber guns were waiting beneath the wings. From above, American pilots wielded the Browning like a scythe in the hands of a hawk. P-47 Thunderbolts dove with fury, their 8-wing-mounted M2s roaring like ripping canvas. The sound a pilot loved was the exact sound a German tank commander dreaded. That snarling metallic rip, followed by sparks and explosions as armor plates peeled back like hot paper. Tank crews, locked inside steel coffins, could hear the rounds hammering their hull. The vibration rattled teeth. The fear crawled into the spine. Men crouched low, praying that the next burst wouldn't come through the hatch and end everything in a flash of fire. Even if the tank survived, the machine gun often tore off radios, sights, external fuel tanks, or jammed turrets. The crew emerged shaken, ears ringing, confidence shattered. The tank might fight again. The men, however, would forever dread the faint drone in the clouds. There is a special kind of fear that clings to a soldier when the enemy can kill you effortlessly. That was the M2's true power. Every pull of the trigger delivered a reminder that America owned the future of warfare. Not elegance, not ancient martial glory, just raw, unstoppable production. Factories in Detroit and Buffalo didn't build legends. They built guarantees. They built the kind of weapons that didn't care about reputation or doctrine. They built weapons that did the job, did it every time, and did it everywhere. German doctrine still clung to the idea of elite units and exceptional machines. America clung to the idea that if one machine was good, then 10,000 would be better. And the Browning M2 never jammed, never hesitated, never waited for permission to do its work. One German lieutenant who survived Normandy later said that the most terrifying moment wasn't when he saw the Americans. It was when he realized they didn't need to be seen at all. A distant hill, a distant road, a distant plane. The M2 could fire long before the Germans understood where death was coming from. In Italy, mountain defenses once thought impregnable became brittle. The Americans dragged Browning M2s up winding trails and set them on ridgelines. High above the battlefield, their tracers drew red signatures across the night, shredding whoever dared move. German soldiers left behind diaries describing the terror of a weapon that appeared on impossible slopes, as if war itself had taken the high ground. And aboard ships at sea, the M2 earned a different kind of reverence. It became the shield against the desperate final blows of the Luftwaffe. Kamikaze dives, torpedo runs, strafing attacks. Sailors stood behind their guns with jaws clenched and eyes focused, cutting streaks of fire into the sky, turning deadly aircraft into falling smoke. Those who served the Browning on the water called it the voice of survival. Even if a bomber or fighter got through, one stray burst from an M2 could rip through wings, punch into engines, or snap control surfaces. Pilots who survived encounters often landed in trembling silence, staring at holes the size of fists in their airframe. Behind every hole was a moment that could have been their death. By late war, fear had no rank restriction. A general climbing into a staff car felt vulnerable. A motorcyclist delivering orders knew one burst could sever both rider and machine. German logistics slowed to a crawl, not because they lacked fuel alone, but because the .50 caliber turned every movement into a wager against fate. That kind of weapon doesn't just wound the body, corrodes the will. Panzer commanders began altering routes not because of maps or objectives, but simply to avoid open ground within sight of American lines. Infantry squads crawled instead of marched. Communication faltered because radios could not always be repaired after M2 fire crippled vehicles. The German army, once defined by speed and shock, turned into an army creeping through fear. And through all of this, the M2 was so simple. One gun, one design, one purpose, made by a nation that believed reliability was king. German troops admired the elegance of their own equipment. Precise optics, advanced tanks, beautifully engineered aircraft. But in the end, engineering sophistication became a fragile luxury. When a complex machine failed or was destroyed, replacing it was a nightmare. When an M2 was damaged, the Americans simply unpacked another from the nearest crate. This was the difference between a nation designed for war and a nation forced into one. And the Germans felt that difference every single time a .50 caliber round zipped past their helmets. By 1945, the Browning had become a symbol of inevitability. It did not mark American dominance with glorious speeches or glamorous propaganda. It marked dominance with the simple fact that in nearly every direction a German soldier looked, the same cold black barrels were staring back at him. The strangest part was that, after the war ended, the Browning continued serving. It outlasted the Reich it helped defeat. It outlasted entire generations of weapon development. It found a place on Korean hilltops, in the jungles of Vietnam, in desert convoys, and aboard modern aircraft. It became timeless. The weapon that Germans hated most became the weapon that history refused to retire. Modern soldiers, long removed from Normandy or Anzio or the snowy forests of the Ardennes, continue to trust their lives to Ma-Deuce. And somewhere in the footnotes of history, the voices of German survivors echo still. If you heard the .50 caliber, it might already be too late. The gun that was never meant to be anything extraordinary proved that winning a war doesn't require perfection. It only requires something that works everywhere, every time, in every role. Victory didn't belong to the most advanced weapon. It belonged to the one that never stopped firing. The German infantrymen of 1943 entered combat with a deep belief that training, discipline, and doctrine would overcome any numeric disadvantage. The Wehrmacht had been built on the principle of mission-oriented tactics, where initiative and skill outweighed brute force. They had already proven this during the Blitzkrieg, carving through Europe with calculated efficiency. Yet, as the war widened and tides shifted, they began to confront a new and unsettling enemy characteristic: the overwhelming, ever-present American .50 caliber machine gun. When German troops advanced or defended, they expected recognizable threats: rifles, light machine guns, mortars. But as encounters with American forces increased in North Africa, Italy, and later France, they encountered something that broke the familiar rhythm of battle. They learned to identify the distinct, deep, thunderous rhythm of the Browning M2. It was not the ripping buzz of the German MG-34 or MG-42. It was a slower, heavier beating sound like a blacksmith hammering on steel. German soldiers described it as a noise that felt closer to artillery than small arms, a weapon that could reach out and destroy from distances where they could not respond. Ground engagements quickly exposed these differences. A German armored car commander engaging American reconnaissance units might assume superiority against lightly armed scouts. But instead of seeing scattered rifle fire, he was suddenly smothered by .50 caliber impacts smashing into armor that should have protected him. The thin plating on most German half-tracks and armored cars was built only to resist rifle caliber fire. The Browning M2 punched through such protection with ease. A vehicle that would have shrugged off small-caliber bullets became a fragile tin box under .50 caliber assault. Reports told of rounds that penetrated a vehicle's outer shell and then ricocheted inside like a bouncing hail of metal, wounding or killing every soldier trapped within. Survivors recounted watching their comrades shredded by fragments of their own armor as it broke apart from the inside. This was not simply firepower. It felt like a violation of safety, a weapon that stripped away both physical and psychological protection. U.S. armored columns rarely moved with a single machine gun. The .50 caliber became a crown mounted proudly atop jeeps, half-tracks, tanks, scout cars, and trucks. Even medical evacuation vehicles occasionally had one for protection. To a German infantry platoon caught in the open, these columns looked like rolling fortresses spilling fire in every direction. A standard American infantry company could deliver far more heavy automatic fire than its German equivalent, largely thanks to the ubiquitous M2. German troops advancing across broken fields or hedgerow-lined roads suddenly discovered that any American vehicle could tear them apart. There was no safe direction. Retreating across open terrain became almost suicidal. The .50 caliber reached targets that had previously been outside the threat envelope of infantry weapons. Cover that would easily halt rifle rounds, such as brick walls or sandbag emplacements, crumbled under .50 caliber strikes. Even trees, thick and sturdy, splintered into dangerous fragments. Soldiers hiding behind trunks found them shattered, exposing their position with deadly consequences. Examples from Tunisia reveal German infantry pinned down for hours by just 2 American jeeps firing their .50s from long range. The German platoon leader initially assumed he was under attack from a full armored unit. Such was the scale and confidence of the fire raining upon them. Every attempt to maneuver was answered with precise bursts that kicked up fountains of dirt around them. The message was clear: don't lift your head. They were immobilized not by numbers but by fear of instant death. In the shattered terrain of Italy's mountain passes, the M2 proved equally destructive. German defensive doctrine relied on holding commanding high ground and forcing attackers through narrow kill zones. But the .50 caliber turned the tables. American units could fire uphill with accuracy and power, chipping away at rock cover and making German machine gun nests increasingly untenable positions. A German fortification that was supposed to dominate the valley below instead found itself suppressed, hammered by repeated impacts that broke stone apart and rendered once secure defenses fragile. A captured German officer described the feeling: the Americans brought artillery with them, but they fired it from their trucks. That was how German ground troops perceived the M2. It blurred the line between infantry fire and heavier support weapons, making every American patrol a mobile threat that Germans could not easily predict or counter. The psychological toll deepened as soldiers realized that range no longer equaled safety. In training, German infantry learned distance as a protective measure. Beyond a certain number of meters, enemy rifles became imprecise. Even medium machine guns had limits. But the Browning M2 reached out to over 2,000 meters with deadly capability. Snipers who once operated confidently at long distances found themselves hunted by an enemy weapon that could track them with ease. Attempts to withdraw from battle under the cover of distance turned into massacres. One report from Normandy detailed the destruction of a German column forced to retreat along a road exposed to American vehicles positioned on a ridge nearly a mile away. German soldiers dove into ditches, assuming they had escaped the threat. Yet the .50 rounds still found them, chewing through earthen walls and pumping ground material into the air. Survivors later admitted they could not believe a machine gun could maintain accuracy and killing power from such range. They assumed Americans were using field artillery. The effect on morale was profound. German commanders instructed troops to prioritize the elimination of American heavy machine gun teams. But the Americans had placed the weapon on nearly every platform. Even if a gun position was destroyed, 3 more would appear a moment later. It seemed inexhaustible, an ever-present curtain of fire. Destroying the weapon became as pointless as trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. This phenomenon emerged from a deeper truth: American logistics. German soldiers often joked grimly that Americans fought like men who did not care about ammunition. Bursts were long, Engagements were loud and ceaseless. German doctrine emphasized fire discipline and careful use of resources. American troops, by contrast, could spend thousands of rounds to neutralize a single threat without fear of shortage. For German infantry caught in the open, this meant every moment exposed was a moment under fire. The growing resentment toward the .50 caliber weapon reflected a shift in German perception of their enemy. The Americans were no longer inexperienced, uncoordinated newcomers. They were adapting, and they wielded a weapon that represented technological pragmatism, something the Germans had undervalued. The M2 was simple, rugged, and endlessly supplied. It didn't jam easily. It didn't require delicate maintenance. It just fired and fired and fired. In the thick hedgerows of Normandy, where every field felt like a trap, the .50 played a role in erasing German tactical advantages. Ambush positions designed to bleed the enemy dry were instead exposed by heavy fire smashing through foliage. Side armor on Panzer IVs and armored personnel carriers, which should have been safe from rifle-caliber threats, were perforated like paper under close-range bursts. Even the German Tiger I, a monster of armor and steel, was not immune to the .50's impact on exposed components like vision slits, tracks, periscopes, and engine compartments. Stories spread quickly through ranks. Rumors grew, mixing truth with battlefield terror. Some German infantry believed that the .50 could punch through the front armor of a Panther at long range. Others claimed the bullets could ignite fuel with every hit. While exaggerated, these fears revealed a consistent theme. The M2 defied expectation, and that is what made it terrifying. Troops began to hesitate when encountering American vehicles, delaying actions that once would have been instinctive. Even the sight of a jeep mounted with a heavy machine gun required careful planning to eliminate. Small American patrols gained disproportionate influence on the battlefield simply by possessing a weapon that Germans respected far too much. One German after-action report bitterly noted, "Their smallest vehicle becomes a fortress, and their fortress moves like a wolf among sheep." The rising frustration translated into a deeper hatred for the weapon and, by extension, its users. Germans did not hate Americans for their tactics alone. They hated them because this unfamiliar presence of constant, unstoppable fire challenged their identity as warriors who excelled through precision and efficiency. By 1944, the psychological war had fully matured. German infantry would rather face artillery barrages, which at least offered predictable intervals between strikes, than the ceaseless hammering of a weapon that could change direction at a moment's notice. The Browning M2 had become an omnipresent battlefield predator, appearing in every engagement, dominating every encounter, undermining every tactic that German infantry had trusted. The hatred German troops developed for the .50 caliber machine gun was not born from disrespect. It was the opposite. It stemmed from the growing recognition that the Americans had mastered an approach to warfare that Germany could not match. The M2 was the physical embodiment of an enemy that refused to play by the old rules of combat. An enemy that leveraged industry and logistics as force multipliers rather than tactical finesse. Faced with this, German infantry found themselves in a harsh new reality. Excellence in skill could not compensate for being outgunned at every turn. The M2 Browning became an unwanted symbol of American ascendancy, a weapon that reminded Germans with every booming burst that the war had shifted irreversibly out of their favor. The ground soldiers' battlefield had changed, and the Americans held the advantage not only in numbers but in a relentless weapon that defined modern combat. German infantry learned a painful truth. Fear of the M2 did not fade once the firing stopped. It lingered in their thoughts, reshaped their tactics, and gnawed at their confidence as they marched into battles increasingly defined by American firepower supremacy. Night came as a different kind of terror for the German infantrymen. The battlefield, already chaotic under daylight, transformed into a world of distorted shadows and unknown movements. For decades, armies relied on darkness for concealment, mobility, and surprise. Under the moon, even a smaller, weaker force could slip through lines, infiltrate positions, and strike unexpectedly. German doctrine emphasized this advantage. Night raids were one of their proudest tactical weapons, honed since the First World War. Yet, as the conflict against American forces matured, German troops discovered that darkness no longer guaranteed invisibility. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun stripped the night of its protective veil. Its range, power, and tracer visibility turned every shadow into a possible kill zone. Before facing the Americans, German soldiers trusted in a familiar safety net: the enemy's inability to see and shoot effectively at long distances during darkness. But U.S. units, armed with searchlights, star shells, and vehicle-mounted illumination, changed that balance. A silent field could suddenly burst into bright daylight conditions, exposing German movement in the open. And in the center of that artificial sunrise was always the same relentless sound: the deep, hammering roar of the .50. Imagine a German reconnaissance patrol crawling through darkness near Anzio. Their orders were clear: determine the size of the American defensive position ahead. They advanced cautiously, believing the cover of night offered safety. But the Americans had mounted .50s on nearly every defensive position, pointed outward like blind guardians waiting for a sign of movement. Once a German soldier's boot kicked loose a rock, the sound echoed faintly. A flare fired into the sky. The darkness vanished. The patrol froze, caught between instinct to drop and fear of being spotted. Then the machine gun began its work. The first burst came high, then corrected downward into the brush, the red tracers glowing like comets streaking through the night. The sudden illumination burned into German memory. Each tracer marked a path of destruction, leaving a trail that said, "I see you. I can reach you. I will kill you if you move." Soldiers scrambled desperately for cover, but the .50 punctured through bushes and light trees as if they were nothing but paper screens. In countless reports, German survivors described night engagements involving the .50 as horrifying, not simply because of casualties inflicted, but because the weapon erased the darkness itself. Visibility had become a weapon of war. The Americans understood this, attacking night infiltrators with overlapping arcs of fire that created entire zones of lethal exposure. Jeep-mounted patrols multiplied this terror. Small, agile, and equipped with powerful illumination tools, American scouts moved through battlefield perimeters like predators sweeping through tall grass. A pair of jeeps with .50s could halt an entire German company's infiltration effort. Every burst painted fiery streaks that danced through the night sky. Impossible to forget. German soldiers soon realized that even if they couldn't see their enemy, the enemy could always find them. Night reconnaissance, which once felt like clever maneuver, became a gambling game with death. German non-commissioned officers warned their men that American machine gunners were trained to fire not only at the target, but through the target. A bullet that passed through a man might continue another 50 yards before losing lethal velocity. This knowledge weighed heavily on German nerves. Night movement required deep trust in the darkness, and now that trust was gone. One veteran recalled, "We felt hunted. Even the wind in the grass could betray us." The deadly symphony of darkness intensified in the bocage of Normandy. Hedgerows created narrow lanes that turned night patrols into high-risk encounters with unseen gun teams. A German squad maneuvering carefully through a field might think they were silent enough. But the Americans positioned heavy machine guns to command those lanes with unbroken coverage. Once a position identified even the faintest clue of movement, a flashlight flicked on or a star shell spread faint white light across the horizon. That was all the M2 crew needed. German soldiers described the sound of .50 caliber rounds tearing through hedgerow leaves as one of the most chilling noises of the war. Bushes seemed to explode in furious showers of branches and soil. A German rifleman cowering behind vegetation would feel the hedgerow shake violently as bullets hammered into it, sending wood splinters bursting inward. He could taste the dirt and greenery crushed into his teeth, knowing that any moment the rounds could strike him. Night was once a cloak. Now it was a prison. Invisible guns dictated where German troops could move, when they could breathe, whether they would see the sunrise. The psychological toll was devastating. Commanders urged aggressive infiltration to regain tactical initiative, but the men tasked with execution hesitated. Every step forward carried the image of tracer lines cutting across a moonlit field, each one a glowing declaration that death was only a second's mistake away. Fear sharpened into hatred. German machine gunners were among the first to express this emotion openly. They understood firepower and respected enemy weapons when deserved. But the Browning M2 represented something beyond acceptable war. Felt excessive, overwhelming, unsporting. Where German machine guns provided tactical precision, the American .50 delivered brute annihilation. It required less finesse, less calculation. It made battles feel unfair. Night counterattacks, once a hallmark of German resilience, lost their effectiveness. A platoon could exit a tree line undetected. But the moment one silhouette edged too far into the open, dozens of heavy rounds ripped across the field, forcing the entire assault back without ever reaching rifle range. The sound of .50 caliber fire echoing through the darkness also carried its own intimidation. German soldiers insisted the weapons sounded deeper and more authoritative at night, the booming blasts rolling across landscapes like thunder. The echo alone could immobilize a man with fear, persuading him that any further movement would place him directly in its path. One German private recorded in his diary, "The night is theirs. We walk in fear while they shoot in certainty." Even armored vehicles felt vulnerable under cover of darkness. Most German light armor relied on surprise and mobility during night operations. But the M2, with its ability to penetrate thin armor, deflated that strategy. A half-track creeping under moonlight risked catastrophic destruction from an American Jeep or half-track waiting silently behind a hedgerow. The hunter became the hunted. Tracers heightened this dynamic. In daytime, they were tools for adjusting fire. At night, they became terrifying beacons that wrote the weapon's impact into the sky. A German mortar team caught under attack watched glowing lines streak toward them like guided arrows, each one marking death's direction. Soldiers described feeling as if those rounds were sent with their names written on them. Such experiences, repeated across countless small-scale engagements, cultivated a universal truth within German ranks. The .50 caliber machine gun was a weapon that refused to let them rest. Even in their most vulnerable hours, under exhaustion and darkness, they were not safe. Night grazing fire zones were designed intentionally by American commanders. Machine guns were preset to sweep expected infiltration routes. Once firing began, the weapon did the rest. Germans attempting to crawl low to the ground found the bullets hitting at knee height, then lower. The rounds chewed into soil just above where a man's spine would be, leaving no reliable avenue for escape. Men lying face down in the grass could feel the earth shudder beneath them with each impact. Dirt flew upward, peppering their helmets. Every burst could be the last sound they ever heard. The M2 represented American strength extending beyond daylight, a relentless presence that refused to surrender the battlefield even when the sun was gone. For German infantry, night transformed from a strategic asset into perhaps their greatest ordeal. No element of the war felt untouched by the .50. In the heat of day, it dominated open ground. In the claustrophobic hedgerows, it defined movement. At night, it ruled the battlefield entirely, dictating when the enemy could advance, retreat, or merely breathe. German commands eventually shifted tactics out of necessity. Night patrols became shorter. Movements were tightly controlled. And where once bold night raids were considered opportunities to reclaim ground or ambush American positions, they became acts of desperation. What angered German leaders most was not just the losses inflicted, but the systematic removal of their tactical identity. The Wehrmacht prided itself on adaptability and initiative. Now, faced with a weapon that neutralized those advantages, their doctrine began to crack. The hatred German soldiers felt for the .50 was the resentment of a proud warrior forced to accept a new order of war. The Americans wielded firepower like a rulebook, rewriting the battlefield from the ground up. German troops who once expected to dominate through training and discipline now understood they were facing an enemy that fought with the full might of industry and innovation. Night once belonged to them, but the M2 Browning had stolen it away. German prisoners of war, once the sharp edge of a confident military machine, arrived in American custody carrying not only physical exhaustion but also the weight of shattered assumptions. Interviews conducted by Allied intelligence units revealed something that surprised many interrogators. When asked which American weapons they feared most, German soldiers did not first mention flamethrowers, artillery barrages, or tank destroyers. Time and again, they pointed to the same thing, the Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine gun. Captured infantry and officers spoke candidly once the adrenaline of battle faded. Their testimonies became fragments of a larger truth. The .50 caliber had left a deep psychological scar. It was not a weapon they simply fought against. It was a weapon they remembered. One Obergefreiter, captured in the aftermath of the Tunisian campaign, confessed that his platoon had been shocked when first encountering .50 caliber fire. They had advanced confidently toward an American position, expecting to overwhelm lightly armed troops. Instead, they found themselves pinned down in an open wadi as bullets tore into rocks and earth, sending fragments flying into their flesh. He said, "It sounded like a giant slamming a hammer against steel. You knew instantly it would kill you if it found you." He explained how the Waffenamt's manuals prepared them for British and Soviet weapons, but never warned them that every American vehicle might carry a gun capable of slicing through their armor and defenses. Their understanding of battlefield hierarchy collapsed. Recon elements, supply trucks, even ambulances seemed to possess lethal fangs. "Your smallest unit could destroy our strongest conviction," he admitted. In another interview following the fighting at Anzio, a German squad leader described how the .50 made planning nearly impossible. "At first we believed the sound meant an anti-tank rifle was firing at us," he explained. "But then we saw the bullets punching holes clean through our half-track. No one believed a machine gun could do that. We thought the Americans were cheating the rules of war." When interrogators pressed him on what he meant by rules, he clarified, "We expected weapons to behave. Rifles should only reach so far. Armor should protect. Machine guns should suppress but not shatter. Your .50 breaks these truths. It takes away what little confidence a man has left." Another officer from a Panzergrenadier battalion recounted the terror of seeing his armored personnel carrier disabled by a mere reconnaissance jeep. The .50 ripped through the radiator and front plating, forcing the crew to bail out under suppressive fire. Seconds later, the rounds chased them across open ground, punching into the dirt only inches from their bodies. "No gun should do everything," he insisted. "This one does." Among Luftwaffe ground troops repurposed as infantry, the hatred ran even deeper. They had been trained to respect the laws of ballistics, to calculate angles and distances with confidence. The .50 caliber made a mockery of such skill. "We would take cover behind stone walls, believing ourselves safe," recalled one aviation mechanic turned rifleman. "Then suddenly the stones exploded into dust, and we realized our shield was nothing." Even those experienced in heavy combat felt shaken. A veteran Fallschirmjäger interrogated after the Normandy landings compared the .50 to artillery in psychological effect. "Its impact is too sudden," he said. "When artillery fires, you learn to recognize its whistle and time your reaction. The .50 gives you nothing. No warning. Only the strike." Some testimonies focused less on the weapon's damage and more on what it represented. A Wehrmacht lieutenant captured south of Cherbourg expressed bitter resentment. "It shows us that you fight like a factory," he spat. "You overwhelm instead of outsmart. There is no art in it, only excess." But beneath the contempt was a tone of reluctant admiration. He acknowledged that the M2's widespread use reflected American confidence that resources would not fail them. "Your logistics are a new kind of general," he muttered. "One that never sleeps." Younger soldiers, especially those fresh from replacement depots, expressed a different kind of terror. Their first time under .50 fire left no room for adjustment. They described bullets cracking past their heads before they even spotted the source. "One burst can remove a man, and the night swallows the sound after," a private from the 352nd Infantry Division explained. "You feel hunted by something unseen." Prisoners consistently emphasized that the weapon did not merely inflict casualties. It dictated behavior. Soldiers stopped using roads even when time mattered. They crawled more, moved less, and hesitated always. Entire patrols stalled for fear that a hidden heavy machine gun lay ahead. American intelligence officers took careful notes. Some were surprised that a simple machine gun, designed decades before the war, could wield such influence. But the testimonies were too consistent to ignore. German soldiers were not exaggerating to curry favor or excuse failures. They were describing a lived experience that reshaped how they understood their enemy. One officer put it this way: "The Russian enemy is brutal. The British enemy is stubborn. But the American enemy is abundant. And abundance kills hope." Senior German officers expressed this perspective with more strategic language. They observed that the M2 represented American doctrine: deny the enemy movement, smother initiative, and grind down resistance through overwhelming material advantage. When American forces advanced, their .50s provided a steel curtain behind which infantry and armor could move safely. When Americans defended, those same guns created walls of fire that turned any assault into a costly, likely hopeless endeavor. Captured artillery observers reported shock at seeing .50 caliber guns used for long-range harassing fire. "We once thought only artillery could deny ground," one told interrogators. "But your machine guns fill that role well enough." Many POWs expressed deep respect for the Americans who operated the weapon. The crews seemed calm, focused, and unafraid of mechanical failure. They cleaned their guns religiously, fed them ammo without hesitation, and replaced barrels with practiced ease. German soldiers admired the discipline and confidence such practice required. "They fire as if they expect to be firing all day," one soldier observed bitterly. Even seasoned panzer commanders admitted frustration. The .50 damaged optics, antennas, and external fuel storage. Every glancing strike against a tank, even without penetration, threatened to blind or disable a vehicle that depended on precise coordination. "We heard it pinging against our armor like hail," one commander said. "We knew each strike meant something on the outside was broken." Some testimonies bordered on desperation. The last interrogations in early 1945, taken as German defenses crumbled, show the raw fear that had seeped into German consciousness. A young sergeant described the sound of a .50 firing down a ruined street in Cologne. "It felt like the whole city was screaming. We hid behind concrete, and it still shook the walls. We couldn't understand how something a man could carry onto a vehicle could be so powerful." These prisoners spoke openly of how the weapon robbed them of rest. The distant thudding at night meant American patrols were active. It meant the enemy was awake, alert, and willing to expend ammunition just to make them nervous. "Every shot you fire is a message," said one. "It says, we can afford this. Can you?" To German minds, trained in resource conservation, that message was unbearable. There is a moment in nearly every interrogation where anger briefly gives way to honesty. In those moments, the .50 caliber becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a symbol of defeat. A reminder that the industrial war Germany had committed itself to was unwinnable from the start. One exhausted Oberleutnant, captured in Hungary, summarized the weapon's psychological victory with chilling simplicity. "We hate it because it proves the truth. You have more. Always more." American intelligence officers rarely needed propaganda to counter German ideology. The truth spoken by German prisoners did that task for them. In the voices of defeated soldiers lay a recognition of American power that no pamphlet could have communicated. The .50 Browning was not just feared. It was trusted to destroy wherever it appeared. Testimonies like these painted a picture of a weapon that reshaped the battlefield not only through bullet impact, but through the erosion of enemy confidence. German POWs, stripped of pretense, confessed that the .50 caliber had become a nightmare too big to avoid and too common to escape. The interviews revealed what every German frontline soldier already knew. The Browning M2 was not merely a machine gun. It was one of the most persuasive arguments that American victory was inevitable. In the end, the German soldiers who once mocked American material warfare came to fear the cold, unyielding truth delivered by the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. For them, it was not a weapon defined by elegance, nor by engineering finesse. It was defined by its presence. It was everywhere, mounted on Sherman tanks scanning the hedgerows of Normandy, roaring from the backs of American convoys pushing into the Reich, stretching like walls of fire around the great bomber formations above Germany, carved into the memory of any soldier who watched a single .50 caliber round tear through steel that was meant to protect them. Those who survived its brutal efficiency were often changed by it. Captured Panzer and Luftwaffe veterans admitted that facing an enemy whose weaponry could be supplied in limitless quantities was more terrifying than any new gadget the Nazis could invent. Allied air power and American logistics didn't just win battles. They imposed a psychological weight that no German strategy could lift. The M2 became proof that a new kind of war had arrived. Industrial war. A war where endurance mattered more than doctrine, and where the side that could keep firing the longest would prevail. As the smoke of the Second World War settled, the Browning heavy machine gun remained. It served in Korea, in Vietnam, across the Cold War's frontiers, and into modern conflicts still unfolding today. 80 years after its introduction, soldiers continue to rely on it, trust it, and respect it. For all the innovation that war has summoned since the 1940s, one weapon still stands as a reminder of what truly shaped that global conflict. Not mystery or technological wonder, but relentless reliability backed by a national will to produce enough firepower for every soldier, vehicle, and aircraft that carried the flag of the United States into battle. The Germans feared the .50 not because it was complicated. They feared it because it always worked, and it never stopped coming.